If you grew up in Western Canada, you knew Woodwards. The smell of the bakery rising from the food floor, the donuts with the pink and green and blue icing, the 6 notes of the jingle your mother hummed without thinking on the first Tuesday of every month. Behind that memory was an empire. 26 department stores, 6,000 employees, $1 billion in sales, and a red neon W above Vancouver's skyline that hadn't gone dark since 1944. They survived 2 world wars, survived the Great Depression, survived the flight of every other department store from downtown, survived recessions that gutted the industries their customers worked in. And then, after 101 years on the same corner of Hastings Street, the doors closed, the W went dark, and the building sat empty for 13 years. How does something that was that permanent simply vanish? What went wrong? Chapter 1. The Farm Boy and the Swamp. The story begins with failure. Not one failure, 2. Charles Woodward was born on 19th of July 1852 on a backwoods farm in Gore, Beverley Township, Wentworth County, Ontario. Not a gentleman, not a merchant's son. A farm boy from Loyalist stock who started working other people's land at 14 because his own family's land couldn't keep them. He scraped together enough to buy a cabin on Manitoulin Island in 1875 and tried his hand as a trader. It didn't take. He tried again at Thessalon, on the north shore of Lake Huron, with marginally better results. By 1891, at 38 years old, Charles Woodward had 2 failed businesses behind him and a family to feed. He put them on the Canadian Pacific Railway and headed west. Vancouver in 1891 was 5 years old. The Great Vancouver Fire of 13 June 1886 had leveled roughly 1,000 wooden buildings in under 45 minutes, killing at least 21 people. Squamish canoes had paddled across Burrard Inlet to pull survivors from the water. By the time Charles arrived, the city had been almost entirely rebuilt in brick. 13,000 people, and rising fast on CPR money. The whole place smelling of fresh lumber and salt air and ambition. It was the last stop on the continent. If you couldn't make it here, there was nowhere left to go. On 1st March 1892, Charles opened a small dry goods store at Westminster Avenue and Harris Street, what's now Main and Georgia. He sold fabric, household goods, the things a growing city needed. And for a few months, it looked like the third time might be the charm. Then the tuberculosis came. In the summer of 1892, Charles lost his wife and 2 of his children. The corporate histories that came later, the anniversary books, the commemorative pamphlets, almost never mention this. They skip from the store opening to the expansion, as though the trajectory was smooth and inevitable. It wasn't. A man who'd failed twice, who'd dragged his family across a continent on faith, buried his wife and 2 children in a city he'd lived in for less than a year. He was alone in Vancouver with a small shop and a grief that doesn't appear in the company records. He kept the shop open. The 1893 Depression hit. Credit dried up across the country. Charles was deep in debt and operating a dry goods store in a frontier city that was itself barely solvent. But Vancouver kept growing. The CPR made sure of that. And Charles had the one quality that separates the people who build things from the people who merely attempt them. He endured. By the late 1890s, he'd identified a lot at Hastings and Abbott Streets, in the commercial heart of the young city. He bought it at a bargain price, and for good reason. The lot was swamp, 8 feet below the surface. The city drained it for him. On 12th of September 1902, Charles incorporated Woodward Department Stores Leontad, with 6 small Vancouver merchants, a jeweler named Davidson, a crockery merchant named Buchanan, a butcher, a pharmacist, and 2 others whose names the records have lost. The partnership soured almost immediately. Within 2 years, Charles had sold his original Westminster Avenue store, bought out every partner, and taken sole control. The new building opened on Saturday, 21st November 1903, to what the Vancouver Daily Province described as a crash of orchestral music. 4 stories of red brick, heavy timber columns milled from local old growth, on the corner of Hastings and Abbott, the busiest intersection in British Columbia. Charles Woodward was 51 years old. He had been failing, in one way or another, for most of his adult life. He would not fail again. Chapter 2. The Beacon. Above the working city. What Charles built at Hastings and Abbott wasn't a department store in the way that Eaton's or the Bay were department stores. Those were carriage trade operations. Marble floors, white glove service, the kind of place where a working man felt underdressed walking through the door. Woodwards was different from the start. Charles was a Methodist, a teetotaler, a Mason, Acacia Lodge, BC Grand Lodge, and he had the radical conviction that ordinary people deserved good merchandise at honest prices without being made to feel small for shopping there. He called himself the working man's friend, and it wasn't just a slogan. Woodwards was among the first Canadian employers to offer staff profit sharing and group insurance, decades before the welfare state made such things ordinary. The people who worked for him had a stake in the business, and they stayed. The turnover was remarkably low for retail. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1903 transformed Vancouver from a CPR stop into a genuine Pacific port city, and it transformed Woodwards along with it. Thousands of prospectors passed through the city buying provisions, and the store prospered greatly. By the late 1910s, Charles had launched a mail-order catalog, the Great Mail Order House of the West, first published in 1897, reaching the Cariboo, the Kootenays, the Peace River Country, and the Yukon. Separate food catalogs followed from 1902. For rural British Columbia, the homesteads and mining camps and fishing villages that were scattered across a province bigger than France, the Woodwards catalog was a window to the city. You ordered your work boots, your kitchen pots, your children's school clothes, and they arrived by railway or coastal steamer, wrapped in brown paper with the Woodwards name on the label. In 1910, Charles introduced the innovation that would define the store for the next 83 years, a single-price sale day. Everything at the same price, 25 cents. It was a simple idea, almost crude in its directness, and it worked beyond anything Charles could have anticipated. 25-cent day brought people through the doors who might otherwise have never set foot in a department store. They came for the bargains. They stayed because Woodwards treated them like they belonged there. Charles served as Liberal MLA for Vancouver City from 1924 to 1928, placing first among 27 candidates for 6 seats in John Oliver's government. He clashed with his own party over timber policy and the PGE Railway, which tells you something about the man. He'd rather fight his allies on principle than stay quiet for the sake of politics. When he died in Vancouver on 2 June 1937, aged 84, he was the only person interred in a mausoleum in the Masonic Cemetery in Burnaby. The Canadian Business Hall of Fame inducted him in 1986, nearly half a century after his death. He'd built a dynasty. His eldest son, William Cullum "Billy" Woodward, had started at the store in 1907 as a bookkeeper. He'd served overseas with the 1st Canadian Heavy Artillery in the First World War, come home, and worked his way through every department. When Charles died, Billy stepped into the presidency at 52. He was a different man than his father, quieter, more institutional, a builder of systems rather than a builder from nothing. In 1935, he'd been named a charter member of the board of the Bank of Canada, which tells you how far the Woodward family had climbed in a single generation, from a failed Manitoulin Island trader to the inner circle of Canadian finance. King George VI appointed Billy the 16th Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia in 1941, a post he held through the war years until 1946. He was simultaneously running the store and representing the Crown. The working man's friend's son was now the working man's friend who dined with the King's representative, because he was the King's representative. It was Billy's brother Percival, everyone called him Puggy, who gave Woodwards its most recognizable feature. In 1927, Puggy designed a 75-foot steel beacon tower for the roof of the Hastings store. Its searchlight emitted a 2 million candle power beam, rotated 6 times a minute, and was visible from Vancouver Island. On a clear night, you could see the Woodwards beacon from the deck of a ferry in the middle of Georgia Strait. During the Second World War, the beacon was ordered dimmed, a target in a city that feared Japanese submarine attack. In 1944, it was replaced with something simpler and more enduring, a 16-foot red neon letter, W, mounted on a 25-meter replica of the Eiffel Tower. From 1944 until 1993, that red W was Vancouver's most recognizable skyline element after the Hotel Vancouver. If you flew into Vancouver at night, it was the first thing you saw. If you grew up in the city, it was as permanent as the mountains. Puggy had also been the architect of the thing that truly set Woodwards apart from every department store in North America. The basement of the Hastings flagship had been converted into a self-serve grocery, the food floor. It was a revolutionary concept, a full-service supermarket inside a department store, in an era when groceries were still sold over the counter by clerks who fetched your items from the shelves. At Woodwards, you walked in, picked up a basket, and chose your own food. By 1952, the Hastings food floor covered more than 60,000 square feet, and Woodwards was advertising it, without exaggeration for once, as the largest grocery store in the world. Chapter 3. 149 Day, Tuesday. The story of the jingle is the story of the store in miniature. On 17th of February 1958, a CKNW radio producer named Tony Antonius sat down at a typewriter. He hit a key, heard the bell ring at the end of the carriage return, ding, and in that sound, heard a melody. He wrote the jingle in 20 minutes. 149 Day, Tuesday. 6 notes and 3 words. It first aired in April 1958, and within months, it had become the most recognizable commercial melody in Western Canada. By 1951, the old 25-cent day had climbed to 149 Day, held on the first Tuesday of every month. The jingle made it an event. Vancouver transit drivers stocked extra change on 149 Day Tuesdays because they knew the buses heading east on Hastings would be packed. The bus stop at Abbott and Hastings, already busy, became, on the first Tuesday, a scene out of a department store newsreel. Hundreds of people lining up before the doors opened, shopping bags at the ready, knowing exactly what they'd come for. A former Park Royal employee remembered it this way. The very first 149 Day was a zoo. Not hundreds, but thousands of people went through the turnstiles, and trying to keep the shelves full became a total frustration because the aisles were so crowded with customers. The goods ranged from canvas-top running shoes to bath oil, all at the one price. The genius of it was its democracy. A lawyer and a longshoreman reached for the same items at the same counter, and nobody felt out of place. That was the Woodwards promise, the one Charles had made in 1892 and his children had kept. In 1961, the Hollywood Advertising Club gave Antonius's jingle an International Broadcasting Award. A 6-note melody written in 20 minutes by a Vancouver radio man competing against the full weight of American network advertising won an international prize. The jingle ran for 35 years, outlasting the store itself. The post-war expansion turned Woodwards from a Vancouver institution into a Western Canadian one. Edmonton had been in the fold since 1926, when Charles himself had scouted a site at 101 Street and 102 Avenue. Billy Woodward opened a Victoria store in 1945, Port Alberni in 1948. In 1950, Woodwards co-developed Park Royal Shopping Centre in West Vancouver, widely credited as Canada's first enclosed shopping mall. A Woodwards was the anchor, naturally. New Westminster followed on 11th of March 1954, when 4,000 people lined up on opening day. Then Oak Ridge Centre in Vancouver in 1959, which Woodwards itself developed and anchored. Chinook Centre in Calgary in 1960. The chain was crossing the Rockies. At Oak Ridge and at Chinook, engineers installed something that captured the food floor philosophy in mechanical form. A conveyor belt system called the Grocery Parcel Depot. You finished your shopping, handed your bags to a clerk, and received a numbered tag. The bags traveled by conveyor belt through the building to a covered pickup structure in the parking lot, where bag boys loaded them into your car when you drove around. You shopped unencumbered. Your groceries arrived at your trunk as if by magic. It was logistics as theater, the kind of operational detail that made customers feel the store was thinking about their lives, not just their wallets. By the mid-1960s, the Hastings food floor was more than a grocery store. It was a destination. The in-house bakery turned out cinnamon biscuit rolls and donuts with pink, green, and blue icing that every child in Vancouver could identify by smell alone. The deli counter ran the length of a city block. Woodward's brand peanut butter was made on site. Pneumatic tubes carried cash from registers to the counting room overhead, and if you stood in the right spot, you could watch the capsules shooting through the transparent tubes like messages from another century. The Grandstand restaurant fed shoppers who'd spent the morning on the food floor and needed to sit down before tackling the upper departments. And then there were the Christmas windows. Beginning in the 1960s, the Hastings store installed animated Victorian-themed window displays every December. Santa's Workshop, the Lamplighter, the Woodwards Bakery, the Horse and Cart, the Teddy Bears. Mechanical figures moved in endless loops behind frosted glass, and every year, without anyone organizing it, the trip to see the Woodwards Christmas windows became the central family pilgrimage of a Vancouver December. Parents who'd been taken as children brought their own children. Grandparents came alone and stood watching. It wasn't commercial in the way that Christmas retail is commercial now. It was civic. The windows belonged to the city. When the store closed in 1993, an antique dealer named David Rowland phoned the store manager and acquired the entire collection. 6 semi-trailer loads of animatronic figures. They have been displayed every December since 1993 at Canada Place by the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. The Woodwards Christmas windows have now been appearing at Canada Place for more than 30 years, a tradition that has outlived the store by a wider margin than most people realize. Chapter 4. Chunky's Empire. Charles Namby Wynne Woodward, everyone in Vancouver called him Chunky, took the presidency in 1956, the third generation to run the company. He was 32 years old, and he'd inherited something most business heirs only dream about: a brand that was genuinely loved. Chunky was a different kind of Woodward than his grandfather or his father. Charles had been a self-made Methodist who built from nothing. Billy had been a steady administrator who expanded methodically and served the crown. Chunky was a rancher. He'd bought the Douglas Lake Ranch in the Nicola Valley, at roughly 200,000 hectares, the largest ranch in Canada, and his passions were cattle, rodeo, and the open country of the BC interior. He co-founded the Canadian Rodeo Commissions. He was a major patron of BC Place Stadium and the BC Sports Hall of Fame. He ran Woodwards because it was the family business, and he was good at it, but the ranch was where his heart lived. Under Chunky, Woodwards reached for everything. The store opening map from the late 1950s through the mid-1970s reads like a colonization of Western Canadian retail. Oak Ridge, 1959, Chinook Centre, Calgary, 1960, Northgate, Edmonton, and Mayfair, Victoria area, 1963, Parkwood Mall, Prince George, and Guildford, Surrey, 1966, Southgate Centre, Edmonton, 1970, the largest enclosed mall in the region when it opened, Market Mall, Calgary, 1971, Mayfair, Victoria, 1974, Cherry Lane, Penticton, and Seven Oaks, Abbotsford, 1975. Lansdowne Park, Richmond, 1977. By the mid-1970s, Woodwards was the largest retailer in Western Canada, 18 stores and growing. The company's market position was distinctive and deliberate. Eaton's had vacated West Hastings for the Uptown Pacific Center in the late 1960s, repositioning upscale. Hudson's Bay anchored the carriage trade, fur coats and fine china. Woodwards sat in the middle, fashion-forward relative to the Bay, but with the food floor in the basement and $1.49 day on the first Tuesday. Neither cheap nor luxe. The store for families who were doing well enough to want nice things and sensible enough to want them at a fair price. That positioning, right in the center of Western Canadian working and middle-class life, was Woodward's identity. It was also, eventually, the box it could not fight its way out of. In October 1961, Chunky tried something ambitious, a joint venture with Sam Steinberg of Montreal to crack Eastern Canada. 2 stores opened in Quebec, Pont-Vieux on 11 October 1961, and Place Greenfield Park in November, under the name Woodward Steinberg. The partnership collapsed within a year. By 1962, both stores had become Miracle Mart, and Woodwards never returned east of Manitoba. The failure is worth noting not because it damaged the company, the financial exposure was modest, but because it revealed a limit. Woodwards was a Western Canadian institution. Its identity was rooted in a particular geography: the mountains, the Pacific coast, the prairies of Alberta. Transplanted to the strip malls of suburban Montreal, it was just another department store. The brand meant nothing without the place. Miracle Mart itself went bankrupt in July 1992, 5 months before Woodwards. The two ventures that couldn't survive together couldn't survive apart either. Chapter 5. The highest point on the skyline. The peak, when it came, looked nothing like a peak. It looked like permanent success. By 1986, Woodwards operated 26 department stores and roughly 33 Woodwind discount outlets across British Columbia and Alberta. Annual sales reached $1.1 billion. Assets totaled $396 million. The company ran Woodward Books, Furniture Fair Warehouses, Woodwards Travel, and, improbably, the Canadian master license for Abercrombie & Fitch, operating 4 upscale stores in Vancouver, Edmonton, Toronto, and Montreal. 6,000 people drew a Woodwards paycheck. The red W still turned above Hastings Street. The jingle still played every month on CKNW. The Christmas windows still went up in November. The food floor still smelled of cinnamon biscuit rolls and fresh bread, and the particular warm humidity of a bakery working at full capacity since 5 in the morning. From the outside, from the perspective of the customer walking through the Hastings Street entrance on a 1/49-day Tuesday in 1986, the store was exactly what it had always been: permanent, beloved, as solid as the brick Charles had laid in 1903. But 1986 was not 1956, and if you knew where to look, the signals were already visible. Eaton's was gone from West Hastings, had been gone for nearly 20 years, having decamped for the glass and chrome Pacific Center uptown. The foot traffic on Hastings Street had been changing since the 1970s. Deinstitutionalization of Riverview Hospital's psychiatric patients had driven thousands of people into the single-room occupancy hotels that lined the streets east of Abbott. By the mid-1980s, the downtown east side was becoming something that Charles Woodward could not have imagined when he drained that swamp in 1902. A neighborhood defined not by commerce, but by poverty, addiction, and the failure of every level of government to house the people it had discharged from care. And on 30th October 1985, a warehouse store called Costco opened its first Canadian location on Brighton Avenue in Burnaby. The building it occupied had previously been a Woodwards Furniture Fair outlet. The competitor that would help end Western Canadian department store retailing was literally moving into Woodward's vacated real estate. The future was arriving in the space the past had just abandoned. Chunky Woodward had been stepping back from daily operations since the late 1970s, devoting more of his time to Douglas Lake Ranch and the rodeo circuit. He remained chairman, but the operational grip was loosening. The company had opened Coquitlam Center in 1979, then 4 new stores in 1981, including Woodgrove Center in Nanaimo. By 1985, it had opened inside the West Edmonton Mall, the largest shopping center in the world. It looked like confidence. It looked like a company that believed in its own future so completely that it was willing to bet on 4 new stores in a single year. What it actually was, what nobody inside the company would admit for another decade, was the last surge of a family enterprise running on inherited momentum, expanding into the teeth of the worst recession British Columbia had seen since the Great Depression, financing the growth with debt it would never repay, and placing every new store in suburban malls designed for a retail format that American competitors were about to render obsolete. The peak is always the moment just before the fall, and the fall, when it came, would take everything: the stores, the family, the food floor, the jingle, the W, in a single brutal decade. But in 1986, standing on the Hastings Street sidewalk on a November evening with the red neon turning overhead, and the Christmas windows glowing in the dark, and the smell of the bakery drifting up from the food floor below, you couldn't see any of it coming. All you could see was the W, and the W had been there your whole life. Chapter 6. The Recession Trap. The numbers tell the story before the people do. In August 1981, the Bank of Canada's prime rate hit 21%. Canadian real GDP fell 5% during the 17-month contraction from July 1981 to October 1982. Unemployment, which had sat at 7.6% in 1981, climbed to 11.1% in 1982 and 12.0% in 1983. Those were the national figures. In British Columbia, the recession was nearly 3 times as severe as the rest of the country. The provincial economy contracted by more than 6% in 1982 alone. Forestry and mining, the two industries that had put money in the pockets of the working and middle-class families who shopped at Woodwards, laid off tens of thousands. Vancouver real estate values dropped. Consumer spending collapsed. Alberta, riding the oil boom through the late 1970s, watched the boom turn to bust as global prices softened and the National Energy Program drained investment confidence. Woodwards had opened 4 new stores in 1981. 4 stores carrying all the costs of new leases, new fixtures, new staffing, financed with debt at interest rates that no retailer in modern Canadian history had ever faced. The expansion had been planned during the late 1970s commodity boom, when BC forestry and Alberta oil looked permanent, when the assumption was that Western Canada would keep growing and Woodwards would grow with it. By the time the stores opened, the economy they were built to serve had cratered. The 1981-82 recession didn't kill Woodwards, but it wounded it in a way that the company never fully healed from. The debt load from the expansion sat on the books through the mid-1980s, eating into margins that were already thinning as suburban malls fragmented the customer base and American competitors began circling the border. The downtown east side was changing around the flagship. Deinstitutionalization of Riverview. Hospital patients in the 1970s had deposited thousands of vulnerable people into the single-room occupancy hotels on East Hastings. By the early 1980s, cocaine was cheap and available. The neighborhood that Charles Woodward had chosen in 1902, because it was the commercial center of the city, was becoming the epicenter of something the city didn't want to look at. Working-class foot traffic at the Hastings store, the mothers with strollers, the families on a Saturday, the office workers picking up groceries on the way home, began to thin. Not all at once, gradually. The way a tide goes out, leaving the shore changed without any single wave you could point to. Then came Expo 86. The World's Fair, held on the north shore of False Creek from May to October 1986, was a triumph of civic branding. 22 million visits, a global spotlight on Vancouver as a Pacific Rim city of the future. But the fair had a cost that the brochures didn't mention. In February through April of 1986, an estimated 800 to 1,000 residents of downtown Eastside single-room occupancy hotels were evicted to make way for Expo-related development and to clean up the neighborhood's image for international visitors. Those evictions permanently destabilized the area. The people displaced didn't leave the downtown Eastside. They moved deeper into it, into worse hotels, into shelters, onto the street. The social ecology that had kept Hastings Street functioning as a mixed-income commercial corridor for 80 years was broken in a single season. Woodward's Hastings flagship stood in the middle of all of it, a department store built for working-class families, surrounded by a neighborhood that was losing its working-class families. The parking lot that had once been full on 1.49-day Tuesdays was less full now. The customers who still came drove past things on Hastings Street that would have been unimaginable in 1960. And 30 kilometers to the east, on Brighton Avenue in Burnaby, Costco was in its first full year of Canadian operations. Jim Sinegal's warehouse model was brutally simple. Buy in enormous volume, sell at razor margins, charge an annual membership fee, and strip out every cost that didn't put product on the floor. No Christmas windows, no grandstand restaurant, no pneumatic tubes, no jingle. Just pallets of goods stacked to the ceiling in a concrete box, at prices Woodwards couldn't match without gutting its own identity. Costco didn't compete with Woodwards on service or atmosphere or community attachment. It competed on the only thing that mattered to a family whose income had been hit by the worst recession in 50 years. Price. The format shift was continental, not local. Home Depot, Toys R Us, Future Shop. The American category killers were each taking a department out of the department store and doing it bigger, cheaper, and with deeper selection. A customer who'd once bought electronics, toys, hardware, and groceries in a single Woodwards trip could now drive to 4 different big box stores and pay less at each one. The department store as a concept, the idea that one building could serve every need, was dying across North America. Woodwards, with its unique food floor and its working-class loyalty, lasted longer than most. But lasting longer is not the same as lasting. Chapter 7. Selling the Soul. The most consequential decision in the 101-year history of Woodwards was made in 1986 and executed in 1987. The company sold the entire food floor chain to Canada Safeway. The logic was straightforward. Woodwards needed cash. The food floor was a complex, labor-intensive operation that required its own supply chain, its own distribution, its own refrigeration infrastructure, its own bakeries turning out those cinnamon rolls at 5 in the morning. Running a grocery business inside a department store was expensive. Selling it to a national grocery chain would generate immediate capital, reduce operational complexity, and let Woodwards focus on what the consultants probably called its core department store offering. The logic was straightforward, and the logic was catastrophic. The food floor was not a cost center. It was the reason people came. A customer who arrived at Woodwards for groceries would walk through the department store to get there. She'd see the new children's clothing, the kitchen goods, the seasonal display. She'd stop. She'd buy something she hadn't planned to buy. The food floor was the engine that drove foot traffic through every other department. Selling it was the strategic equivalent of a restaurant selling its kitchen because the rent was cheaper without it. Most outlets converted to Safeway. The Hastings flagship, for which no Safeway interest existed because Safeway didn't want a 60,000 square foot grocery store in the middle of a neighborhood that was losing its middle-class customers, was downsized into an IGA. The largest grocery store in the world, the self-serve pioneer that had been feeding Vancouver since before the Second World War, became an IGA franchise in a department store that now had no reason to exist as a destination. From 1987 onward, Woodwards competed purely on department store goods, clothing, housewares, furniture, electronics, in a recession-flattened market against incoming American discounters, without the one thing that had made it irreplaceable. Every other department store in Western Canada sold clothes. Everyone sold housewares. Only Woodwards had sold all of that and fed your family at the same price, in the same building, on the same Tuesday. Now it was just another department store. And just another department store, in 1987, was not enough. Chunky Woodward stepped fully away from operations in 1988. He'd been loosening his grip for a decade, but the formal handover to professional managers marked the end of 96 years of family control. The specific identities of the executives who took over are a gap in the public record, a gap that sits in the BC Supreme Court's CCAA file from December 1992, waiting for someone to pull it. What we know is that they were not Woodwards. They had not grown up in the store. They did not carry the institutional memory of Charles draining the swamp, or Billy standing in as lieutenant governor, or Puggy designing the beacon tower. They were professional managers hired to fix a business that was bleeding, and they could not fix it. On 27 April 1990, Chunky Woodward died in Vancouver. He was 66. The Canadian Encyclopedia would later summarize it with a sentence that lands harder for its restraint. Woodward's department stores faltered dramatically after Charles's death. The last Woodward who understood what the store meant to the people who shopped there was gone. The family that had owned it for 3 generations, Charles the Methodist farm boy, Billy the lieutenant governor, Chunky the rancher, had run out of heirs willing or able to keep the doors open. Douglas Lake Ranch, the largest in Canada, was sold by the family in 1998. The 2 things Chunky had loved most, the store and the ranch, outlived him by less than a decade. The Christmas windows went up at Hastings Street in November 1992. Nobody knew it yet, but it was the last time. Chapter 8, December 11th. On 11th December 1992, Woodward's Stores Limited filed for protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act in BC Supreme Court. The company owed $65 million to creditors. It operated 25 stores. It employed 6,000 people. CBC reporter Kathy Tomlinson covered the filing from an Edmonton store. An employee, on camera, managed the understatement that only a Canadian facing catastrophe can produce. It's not the best, naturally, but everybody keeps trying to carry on. A customer in the same report said simply, "I love Woodwards, I really do." Those two sentences, the employee's quiet refusal to panic and the customer's helpless declaration of loyalty, contain the entire emotional register of what happened next. January 1993. Management announced 1,200 layoffs. 1/5 of the entire workforce gone in a single announcement. No phased program, no retraining fund. 1,200 people who had been stocking shelves and running cash registers and baking cinnamon rolls and hanging Christmas decorations were told their services were no longer required. In mid-January 1993, the exact date wavers between sources, either the 15th or the 31st, the microfilm would settle it. The Hastings Street flagship closed its doors after 90 years of continuous operation. Think about what that means. A store that opened when Theodore Roosevelt was President of the United States and Wilfrid Laurier was Prime Minister of Canada. A store that had survived the 1893 Depression, the death of its founder's wife and children to tuberculosis, 2 world wars, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, the deindustrialization of False Creek, the flight of Eatons to Uptown, the 1970s mall revolution, and the 1981-82 recession. A store whose neon W had turned above the city for nearly 50 years. Closed. Lights off. Doors locked. The W dark for the first time since 1944. The silence that settled over 101 West Hastings was the kind of silence this documentary has been building toward. The silence of a building that isn't supposed to be empty. The food floor, already diminished to a fraction of its former self, went dark. The escalators stopped. The pneumatic tubes carried nothing. The bakery ovens cooled. Outside, the downtown east side, which had been circling the building like weather for a decade, moved in closer. In June 1993, Hudson's Bay Company announced the acquisition of 21 of Woodward's 25 remaining stores for $235 million. The deal was overseen by HBC President George Kosich, under Chairman Donald McGivern, and controlling shareholder Kenneth Thompson. On 12 August 1993, 13 former Woodwards locations reopened as the Bay. 10 began conversion to Zellers, HBC's discount chain, itself destined for liquidation 2 decades later when its leases were sold to Target Canada, which would go bankrupt on 15 January 2015. 4 stores were liquidated outright, 3 in Edmonton, Southgate Centre, Mill Woods, Northgate, and 1 in Coquitlam. Edmonton was by far the most impacted city. All but one of the outright closures happened there. The city that Charles Woodward had first visited in 1922, that had been Woodward's beachhead on the prairies for 67 years, lost most of its stores in a single afternoon. Biennial employee reunions continued from the early 2000s through a final gathering in 2018. Former colleagues meeting to remember a place that no longer existed, in a city that had moved on. HBC did not buy the Hastings flagship. Nobody did. Gordon Price, the urban planner who later became a CBC commentator, offered the epitaph that every Vancouverite understood. It was one of the least surprising surprises. It was amazing Woodwards held on that long given the fate of department stores, and in particular, in that location. There were no mass protests at the time. Woodwards had long avoided unionization through Charles's original strategy of profit sharing and group benefits. A strategy that meant there was no union to organize a fight, no picket line, no sit-in. The provincial and federal governments did not attempt a rescue. The store simply closed, and 6,000 people went home, and the biggest brick building on Hastings Street went dark. The protests would come later. They would come for the building itself. Chapter 9. The emptiest block in Vancouver. For 13 years, 101 West Hastings sat empty. That sentence needs no embellishment. 13 years. A 700,000 square foot department store, on the busiest intersection in British Columbia's history, sat vacant from 1993 to 2006. The city grew around it. The condos went up in Yaletown and Cole Harbour. the Olympics were awarded and planned. Vancouver became one of the most expensive real estate markets on the planet. And the Woodwards building, Charles's Swamp, Puggy's Beacon, Chunky's flagship, rotted. The building passed through hands like cursed property. Fama Holdings bought it in 1995 with plans for a market condo redevelopment. The Downtown Eastside Residents Association, led by Jim Green, organized opposition demanding social housing. The project died. In January 2001, the BC NDP government under Premier Ujjal Dosanjh bought the building for $21.9 million through BC Housing, proposing up to 275 cooperative housing units. Then, the BC Liberals under Gordon Campbell won the May 2001 election and shelved the project in early 2002. The neighborhood around the empty building had continued its descent. The HIV epidemic of the mid-1990s hit the downtown Eastside with a ferocity that public health officials compared to sub-Saharan Africa. In 1997, the chief medical health officer declared a public health emergency. Intravenous drug use, homelessness, mental illness, the grinding poverty of a neighborhood that had lost its last middle-class anchor when Woodwards closed, all of it concentrated within a few blocks of the Dark W. On 14th of September 2002, activists broke through the doors. Ivan Drury, now a history instructor at Fraser International College, and videographer Sid Chow Tan led a group into the empty building and occupied it, demanding that the provincial government restore funding for social housing. They called it the Wood Squat. Within days, 54 people were living inside the shell of the store that had once sold cinnamon rolls and canvas running shoes at $1.49. 6 days later, on 20th of September, a BC Supreme Court injunction was issued. Vancouver police in riot gear entered the building and arrested 54 squatters at gunpoint. Subsequent reoccupation attempts drew heavier force. Drury's shoulder was dislocated during one encounter. Court documents eventually counted 58 arrests across multiple waves. A tent city formed on the surrounding sidewalks and sustained itself through donations for 3 months. The Friends of the Woodward Squat published a serial newsletter, at least 45 issues, documenting the standoff. The images that circulated through Vancouver's media were extraordinary in their contrast. Homeless people sleeping in tents on the sidewalk outside a building that had once been the largest grocery store in the world, beneath a tower that had once held a 2 million candle power searchlight visible from Vancouver Island, in a neighborhood that a Methodist farm boy from Ontario had chosen for his life's work because it was the beating commercial heart of the city. In November 2002, the municipal election delivered a verdict. COPE, the coalition of progressive electors, swept to power on a platform that included converting Woodwards into social housing. Larry Campbell defeated NPA candidate Jennifer Clark for mayor. Jim Green, who had been fighting for housing on that site since the Fama Holdings days, won a council seat. On 12th of December 2002, the tent city residents accepted placements in SRO hotels, and the Wood Squat formally ended. The demand for 100% social housing was not met. Drury, speaking to CBC 20 years later, delivered the kind of verdict that arrives only after you've watched the political process from close enough to smell it. The lesson I learned, and it's probably not fair to the good ones, is don't trust politicians. Chapter 10. The W returns. The city bought the building from the province for $5 million in 2003, a price that tells you how badly everyone wanted the problem solved. Councillor Jim Green led a public consultation. In September 2004, the city selected Westbank Projects and Peterson Investment Group, with Henriquez Partners Architects under lead designer Gregory Henriquez, to redevelop the site. The condo pre-sales, managed by Bob Rennie of Rennie Marketing Systems, sold out 536 units to 1,200 registrants in December 2005. On 30 September 2006, Pacific Blasting demolished the Woodwards building with a controlled rollover implosion. Everything came down except the 1903-08 Heritage Corner, Charles's original red brick corner, preserved. The Neon W had been removed beforehand and placed in storage. What rose in its place was a $400 million mixed-use complex that became, depending on whom you asked, either the most important social housing project in Vancouver's history or the spark that gentrified Canada's poorest postal code. Two towers, the 43-story W43 and the 32-story W32, held 536 market condominiums. Beside them, in the same complex, sat 200 non-market housing units, 125 singles units operated by PHS Community Services Society, and 75 family units operated by the Affordable Housing Society. Simon Fraser University's School for the Contemporary Arts occupied 130,000 square feet. A Nestor's Market opened on 8 December 2009 in the basement, the first new food floor since the Safeway sale in 1987, though smaller than any Whole Foods within an hour's drive. London Drugs, TD Canada Trust, a daycare, civic offices, National Film Board offices. On 9 January 2010, a replicated W, now LED illuminated, was installed atop the new tower. The original neon W was mounted in the public atrium, beside a bar called The Charles, named for the founder. On the building's Abbott Street face, artist Stan Douglas installed a 30-foot by 50-foot glass mural called Abbott and Cordova, 7 August 1971. A meticulously recreated photograph of the 1971 Gastown riot, the day Vancouver police on horseback charged into a crowd of 2,000 people protesting marijuana laws. A basketball hoop hangs above the mural. The past, at Woodwards, doesn't stay behind glass. It plays pickup games underneath it. Gregory Henriquez told Arch Daily in 2017, "What every architect who works in contested space eventually has to say, Woodwards was sort of born out of that context, and we actually were even more successful than we wanted to be. The level of gentrification in the neighborhood has exploded, and Woodwards, for all intents and purposes, is a great success." Whether that success belongs to the people who squatted in the building in 2002 or the people who bought condos in it in 2005 is a question Vancouver has not settled and probably never will. The site contains roughly 20% social housing. The squatters demanded 100%. Property values in the surrounding downtown east side rose 303% between 2001 and 2013. The people the housing was built for and the forces the development unleashed exist in a tension that no amount of architectural genius can resolve. The Woodward story does not end at one address. It ends across an entire industry. Eaton's, the other great Canadian department store dynasty, filed for creditor protection on 27 February 1997, closing 21 of its 85 stores and laying off 2,000 workers. It filed for final bankruptcy on 20 August 1999. Sears Canada followed. Zellers, the discount chain into which 10 Woodward stores were converted in August 1993, had its leases sold to Target Canada in 2011. Target Canada went bankrupt on 15 January 2015. Every single store closed. And Hudson's Bay Company, the firm that bought 21 Woodwards locations for $235 million in 1993, received a CCAA initial order on 7 March 2025, with a final store closing deadline of 15 June 2025. The buyer that absorbed Woodwards was itself absorbed by the same forces that killed it. The entire chain is gone now. Eaton's, Woodwards, Simpsons, Zellers, Sears Canada, Target Canada, Hudson's Bay. Every major Canadian department store chain that existed in 1990 is either dead or dying. What replaced them is Costco and Walmart and Amazon, American operations that sell more, employ fewer, and have no memory of any particular place. Chapter 11. What the W remembers. The Christmas windows still go up every December at Canada Place. David Rowland's 6 semi-trailer loads of animatronic figures, Santa's Workshop, the Lamplighter, the Teddy Bears, have been displayed every year since 1993, 33 years and counting. Families still come. Children still press their faces to the glass. The figures still move in their endless mechanical loops, powered by motors that are older than most of the parents standing behind the children watching them. Tony Antonius's jingle outlived him. He died on 25 January 2019. In 2006, when Bob Rennie's team needed to market the Woodwards condominiums, they licensed the jingle, the 6 notes that had brought thousands of people to 149-day Tuesdays for 35 years. Antonius's price for the license was $3,000, paid not to himself, but in $1,500 donations to the New Westminster Arts Council and the Vagabond Players. He didn't want the money. He wanted the music to matter for something other than selling real estate on the grave of the store it had been written to serve. The original Neon W sits in the public atrium of the Woodwards Redevelopment, next to the Charles Bar, surrounded by million-dollar condominiums. The replicated LED W turns above the tower, visible from the harbor, visible from the bridges, visible from the same angles that Puggy's beacon once reached with its 2 million candle power beam. From a distance, at night, if you didn't know the building had changed, you might think the store was still there. It isn't. What's there is a $400 million monument to the city Vancouver became after Woodwards left. The condo towers, and the social housing, and the SFU Arts School, and the Nestor's Market, and the Stan Douglas mural are all, in their way, attempts to answer a question that the building has been asking since 1993. What do you put in the space where a city used to gather? What replaces the room where 3 generations of Western Canadians met each other, ate cinnamon biscuit rolls, bought canvas running shoes for $1.49, and learned what it felt like to belong to a place? The answer so far is everything and nothing. The building is full. The room is empty. Charles Woodward arrived in Vancouver in 1891 with 2 failed businesses behind him and a family he would lose within the year. He built something on a swamp that lasted 101 years. His son ran it and served the crown. His grandson ran it and ran cattle on the largest ranch in Canada. The 4th generation sold the ranch and did not run the store. The store sold its food floor, filed for protection, and closed. The building sat empty for 13 years, was squatted, was demolished, and was replaced. The W still turns. The jingle is gone. The cinnamon rolls are a memory. The women who lined up at 5 in the morning on 1.49 day Tuesdays are grandmothers now, or they've passed on, and the store they walked through exists only in the particular way a smell can survive in the mind longer than a building can survive on a street. On a clear night from the harbor, the red LED W above 101 West Hastings looks almost exactly like the neon W that Puggy Woodward put up in 1944. Almost. The light is sharper now, colder. It doesn't buzz the way neon does. It doesn't warm the air around it. But it turns 6 times a minute, the way it always has, marking a place on the skyline where something used to be, and something else has taken its place, and the city keeps moving beneath it in the dark.